am Dr. Bobby Du Bois, and welcome to Live Long and Well, a podcast where we will talk about what you can do to live as long as possible and with as much energy and vigor that you wish. Together, we will explore what practical and evidence-supported steps you can take. Come join me on this very important journey, and I hope that you feel empowered along the way. I'm a physician, Ironman triathlete, and have published several hundred scientific studies. I'm honored to be your guide. Welcome back, everyone. Summer has officially arrived, although in Texas, where I live, it's felt like summer for quite a while. During the summer, we spend more time outdoors, exposed to the sun, and it's natural, at least natural for me, to think about what the sun exposure does to us. So today, I'd like to explore sun exposure and what the evidence tells us about its impact on our health and what the evidence tells us about what might protect us from that potential damage. As always, the show notes will have links to some of the studies I'll talk about. If you're interested, I've started regular health tips of the day, about 30-second video reels on sleep or exercise or nutrition or any other topic. Just follow me on Instagram, Dr. Bobby Live Long and Well. So, as always, I want to begin with the take-home messages on sun exposure. First, have fun in the sun. It's great to be outdoors, but protect your skin and protect your eyes. Second, as we will see, the evidence in this area is a bit cloudier than we might want, but I'll hopefully help you find a path through it. The plan for today is to first provide some background on how sun exposure can affect our health, both how long we live and how well we lived. Next, I will walk through the evidence on what causes skin cancer and skin aging, and most importantly, how strong is the evidence on ways to prevent these problems. We will also briefly talk about your eyes and how UV exposure can damage them. Now, I haven't shared this before, but I did want to today, that I have no financial motivation for anything I say. You may not agree with what I say, and by all means, let me know. But no one is providing money for me to say it. The podcast is free. I don't have and will not have sponsors and will not have paid subscriptions. Hopefully, this will reassure you that what I say is what I truly believe, whether I'm right or whether I'm wrong. Many years ago, a colleague shared some advice with me, which I've been reflecting on as I've been thinking about how to prepare my podcast moving forward. She said, when you're talking with audiences, data or presenting evidence makes it believable, but stories, anecdotes, make it memorable. Today, I hope that I can do both, and depending upon your thoughts and feedback, it may become a standard approach. So if you can let me know through my website, that would be great. Do you like this approach? So, let's start with the story. Gail and I live on a ranch in central Texas in a town called Dripping Springs, and we spend a lot of time outdoors taking care of the land and the exotic animals and our bed and breakfast guests. A few months ago, I had a sore on the top of my scalp. Now, I couldn't see it, but I could feel it, and it seemed to be there for quite a while. I assumed I bumped my head, which happens a whole lot around here, whether it's on branches or any number of hard objects I seem to run into. Well, it didn't seem to go away, and I asked Gail what she saw. She told me about it, took a picture of it, and we looked at it together. It didn't look like much, but since it hadn't healed, I decided to get it checked out. Turned out to be a basal cell carcinoma. I'll explain later what this is, but it's a type of skin cancer. So off to the dermatologist I went, got it biopsied, and the skin cancer diagnosis was made. Then to the specialist dermatologist who does the removal. I'm numbed up and don't feel much as he takes it out. Since it was in my scalp, he had to pull the edges back together with a bunch of stitches. Now, it wasn't particularly painful, but over the next couple of weeks, it was pretty uncomfortable. And the whole thing turned out to be a somewhat bigger deal than I expected. During that time, I wondered about how I got the skin cancer and whether the evidence to avoid it was very strong. And with that motivation, I dug into the data, the studies in people, and now, of course, I want to share with you what I found as summer is taking full force. All right, next section. Let's begin with the damage that sun can cause. So the damage from the sun comes from UV ultraviolet exposure. And UVA is the wavelength of greatest problem because it's absorbed deeply in the skin. Now, UV exposure is worse near the water because of the reflections from snow, from sand, and the sun is strongest between the hours of typically 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. And even though it's cloudy, 80% of the ultraviolet penetrates clouds. So when we get to sun protection, even if it's cloudy, you'll want to consider doing it. Now, there's no doubt, and we don't need major studies to know that being in the sun can cause sunburn. It's happened to all of us and everyone we know. And we'll see that sunburns can lead to bigger problems later on. Over the long term, sun exposure ages our skin. And what does that mean? Well, it makes it thinner, it can make it saggier, we can get brown spots and wrinkles. So there's an interesting study, and you know I love my studies. There were 300 women. Now, one group was told to avoid the sun, and the other enjoyed being in the sun. And they examined a whole series of signs of skin aging, like wrinkles, the texture of the skin, pigment changes. And what they found was 80% of the skin damage was directly related or correlated with UV exposure. Now, note, it wasn't 100%. So there is more to aging than just sun. Part of it's genetics, part of it's just getting older. But obviously the lion's share of it related to ultraviolet. Now, okay, so skin appearance doesn't affect how long we live, but it affects our quality of life and how we feel about ourselves. I mean, as we age, we don't necessarily want to look like we're getting older. And later I'll talk a bit about how we can protect our skin from this photo aging or the sun-related aging. Now, here's the bigger issue. Sun exposure can increase our risk of skin cancer. And that's, of course, what sent me down the rabbit hole of trying to understand the issues and then share them with you. A very brief pathology lesson. So the skin is composed of a variety of cells, and many of these cells can become cancerous, like cells elsewhere in our bodies. And the name of the cancer is based on the type of cell it came from. So two of the skin cancers, basal cell carcinoma, that's the one I had, and squamous cell carcinoma, these are ones that can bleed and they grow locally. So they'll grow bigger and bigger and into the areas next to it. Now, they do grow pretty slowly. Now, they can go into lymph nodes, and very rarely they cause serious harm. And if they're found earlier, they should be readily removable and curable. And that's what happened with me. Now, the third type of cancer, which is again a different cell in your skin, is melanoma. It can metastasize. And if it's not caught early, treatment can be really involved, and it can even be fatal. And historically, before some of the better medicines came along, it not infrequently was fatal. So melanoma, which is the dangerous skin cancer, even melanoma, if it's caught earlier, can be cured by removing it. But if we catch it late and it's spread, it can be problematic. Now, we want to avoid any skin cancer, clearly, because it's no fun to have to go through the removal. But melanoma is the most important one. Fortunately, that was not the skin cancer I had. But, we're always at risk, and so I'll keep getting things checked out. Now, of all cancers, skin cancer is the most common. There's about almost 5 million skin cancers a year in the U.S., and it outweighs really all other cancers combined. And there are several 100,000 of those which are melanoma cases, and there's probably overall of people in the United States, over 1 million people who have some stage of melanoma. And again, that's the one we really, really want to avoid. Now, most skin cancers happen in our middle and later ages, in your 50s and 60s and beyond. Now, melanoma can show up in people under 30, so we all need to be mindful of it, keep an eye on our skin, and try to do what we can to really avoid any problems. All right, so this is sort of the background on skin and skin aging and skin cancer. In the next section, I'd like to explore with you, well, who's at risk for skin cancer? Basically, it's people with light skin, and there's a whole grading scheme of light skin to very, very dark skin, but the people with the fairest skin seem to have the greatest problems. On the other end of the spectrum, folks that are black, they have far less likelihood of a skin cancer developing. Now, one group which you might not necessarily have thought of who are at risk for skin cancer are Australians. Now, I love Australians. I love the way they talk, and many of them obviously have moved here. And it turns out a lot of the research on skin cancer comes from Australia. Now, when we talked about saunas, we talked a lot about Finland, but here, skin cancer research and skin cancer risk seems to be higher in Australia. Now, why might that be? Now, there's lots of theories and nobody knows the full answer. It might be that they're closer to the equator than we are. It may be that the people who historically, not the indigenous folks, but the folks who moved there had fair skin. They typically came from Britain and elsewhere. And some blame the hole in the ozone level as the causative factor, and I think that one's been debunked a little bit. But suffice it to say, people in Australia are at higher risk, and therefore the scientific community has been really focused on that. So I want to begin to explore the evidence on sun exposure and its relationship to skin cancer. So the risk of getting melanoma, and again, that's the bad skin cancer or the really bad skin cancer, it correlates with the number of sunburns you experience during childhood. Now, keep that in mind, that there may be a relationship to sun exposure when you're young to problems when you're old, which is different than the risk goes up as you get older with any time you're in the sun. So what this study of studies, a meta-analysis, there were 51 studies. Now, these were observational studies, and as we've talked about and we'll continue to talk about in future episodes, are not as good as a randomized trial. And they basically said, did you ever get a major sunburn? Obviously, we all get sunburn, but some people got ones that really blistered. Those are what we're talking about as the bad ones. And the ones that got sunburn as a child had a 60% increase over those that did not in having a melanoma. And they found what we call our dose response. So the more sunburns you got, and 6 seems to be kind of a magic number, so more than 6 of these bad ones was problematic. So again, the more sunburns you had, the greater the risk. Now, here's the wrinkle, as I alluded to a few moments ago. I mentioned that the number of sunburns seems to relate to the likelihood of getting melanoma, but that's the number of sunburns when you were young. Now, if we start to protect ourselves as we get older, will that stop the problem or reduce the problem? And that's where, as I said, the evidence is a little more cloudy. Now, I was talking about melanoma. There's also a correlation between sun exposure and sunburns and the other two typically non-fatal ones, basal cell carcinoma and squamous cell. It's inevitable whenever I talk to folks about UV exposure, they'll ask me about indoor tanning salons. It's like, okay, well, they use more protective rays, and is that okay? Well, interestingly, there's been a lot of studies on this. There's been, in one article, it was analyzing 36 studies, and they found that there was a 25 to 50% increase in melanoma and the other non-melanoma squamous cell carcinoma in people who were regular suntan booth users. And once again, there was a dose response. So more than 10 a year was a lot worse than 5 a year or once a year. So if you go once a year before you're going to a big party, is that going to cause skin cancer? Not likely. But if you're a regular user, it can be a problem. And then they also found that suntan booth users, when they did develop skin cancer, it tended to come on earlier than you would otherwise expect. As I said earlier, it's typically in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So up until this point in the podcast, the data is pretty strong that ultraviolet exposure can cause troubles. But as I said, this area is a little bit cloudy. And so now I want to talk about where the evidence isn't as straightforward as we'd like. Part of this is that the data is based on observational studies. So in an observational study, you look at people who did something and you compare them to people who didn't do something, and then you follow them forward and you try to adjust for the fact that the two groups may not be identical. It's really hard to think about doing a randomized trial of being in the sun or not being in the sun and asking people to follow those rules for 30 years. So you're not likely to get great randomized trials on some of the aspects of this. So I like to think about the development of a problem as a series of kind of conceptual links. Now, the first three links, the evidence is pretty clear. Link number one, sun exposure leads to sunburn. Doesn't take a randomized trial for all of us probably to believe that's true. The second link, also pretty good data. Sunburns are associated with skin cancer. And then the third link is also pretty good. Studies show that sun protection reduces your exposure to ultraviolet light and the risk of sunburn. So it seems like, oh, we've solved everything. Except where the data gets a little cloudy is, does reducing that ultraviolet exposure and sunburns lead to fewer cancers? Here's the problem. So we know that sun exposure leads to sunburns, which can lead to cancer. And now we want to find out, can we protect ourselves against the sunburns and therefore protect ourselves against the bad things we're trying to avoid? Well, before we get into the data on whether sun protection works as well as we'd like, let's take a slight detour, which is, how do you protect yourself against the sun? So most people think in terms of sunscreens, and there are, different types. There's the mineral and the chemical. Or instead of sunscreens, you can wear clothes, or you can just avoid being in the sun. Now, there's really good evidence that sunscreens reduce skin aging, like the wrinkles and thinning of the skin. So there was a randomized controlled trial of over 900 people. And one group had daily sunscreen use, and the other group, they didn't really require skin protection at all. And they followed them for 4 years, which is a really good time to see changes. And they looked at the skin, the fine lines, wrinkles, and they were focused on the left hand, just to keep it very precise. And what they found is the people who were using the sunscreens had 24% less evidence of aging. So the good news is sunscreens seem to help if your goal is to reduce your skin looking older and older. Now, the data is pretty good that sunscreens reduce the risk of a melanoma. In a randomized trial of 1,600 people in Australia, I mentioned before about Australia, they showed that sunscreen use did reduce melanoma by 50%, not by 100%, but by 50%. Where it's a little less clear is whether the sunscreen improves other cancers, like squamous cell or basal cell. And again, here's another study, randomized trial. There'll be links to these in the show notes, so you're more than welcome to take a look and see what you think. That showed that SPF 15 reduced squamous cell carcinoma, but not the kind I had, the basal cell carcinoma. And in a more recent study, this was part of the NHANES survey that's done here in the U.S. on a very regular basis, they showed that sunscreen use helped people, but long sleeve shirts or staying in the shade didn't really change the risk of squamous cell or basal cell carcinoma. Now that seems a little odd because you would think that, yes, the sunscreens might help, but shouldn't also staying away from the sun or wearing clothes, you would think that would provide equal benefit. But again, the evidence link isn't as powerful as we would like. Suggestive, but not as powerful. Now, this may seem counterintuitive. We made the strong argument that UV exposure is bad, and therefore blocking that UV exposure ought to be good. But let me give you a kind of a tasty tidbit for why the protection doesn't look as wonderful as you might think. People who put on sun protection may inevitably stay in the sun longer. Oh, I don't have to get out of the sun. I don't need to protect my skin because I put on suntan lotion. So these individuals might be out in the sun not just an hour, but maybe 2, 3, or 4 hours. So then when you look at, do people with sun protection have reductions in cancer, it can get murky because maybe those people are actually out in the sun longer. And there's an interesting discussion of this. And again, I'll link this for you. The other problem is that although we may say we put on sunscreen, we may not have done it right. We may not have put on enough. And we may not, and this is often the case, reapplied it multiple times a day. So this is why the data aren't as pure or as perfect as we would like them to be. Okay, so let's now kind of take the evidence and shift to, so what do we do with all this? How does this all net out? Well, if you think guidelines from national clinical societies are a good thing, then the American Academy of Dermatology, they recommend everybody out in the sun should have SPF 30 or greater sun protection. So that's what they say. Well, then, of course, is which type of sunscreen do you want? You know, there's the kind of the standard stuff, which I mentioned before. There's the chemical and there's the mineral ones, and those can be $8 a bottle. And there's now these fancy ones that are, you know, maybe 10 times the price with titanium and other fancy things, and they often come in very small bottles. So the physical ones do create a barrier, and they reflect some of the sunlight, and that's the zinc, the oxide like we know from the past, but there's now the newer ones with titanium. And the chemical ones, they don't so much block the sun, but they convert the rays into heat. The physical ones also do that as well. Probably there is no difference between the two in effectiveness. There's probably no difference between the zinc oxide and the titanium ones in terms of benefits. Now, it's true that the titanium has these nanoparticles, and maybe they absorb a little easier, and maybe they don't look quite as awful on your skin, but it's not clear that they're any more powerful. For me, the best sunscreen is one you're willing to use, because often we walk outdoors and we're like, I don't want that greasy look on my skin. So whatever you find that works for you, that's what is the right type. And ideally, you want to apply it multiple times a day. And if you're really in the sun, and like me in Texas, I sweat like there's no tomorrow, I need to apply it ideally every couple of hours. Now, people say, well, I've got this suntan lotion lying around. Is it still good? Well, most of it should last 3 years or so. So I wouldn't worry if it was, last season's or even the seasons before. I don't think you need to throw them out and start all over. Well, SPF, which is sun protection factor, you see all sorts of numbers, 15, 30, 50, 100. Most of the studies look at SPF 30, so you don't have to do SPF 50 or 100. The SPF 30 blocks 97% of the UVB rays. Now, the real problem is most of us don't apply enough. If you want to do pretty much your whole body, you need to do an ounce, and most of these bottles maybe have 8 ounces. So you're using a lot of the bottle. So that's actually one of the bigger problems. You're not putting it on enough, and you're very often not reapplying it when you could or when you should. Now, personally, I like wearing long sleeve shirts, and I buy the ones that have some SPF protection. I wear ones that are SPF 50. And I like those because then I don't have to worry about putting, the greasy stuff all over my arms. And then I typically wear something around my neck to protect my neck as well. So I don't have to put quite as much sun protection creams and things on me. Here's another problem. I'm a man, and we men have all sorts of problems in life. But one is that we're not good at sun protection. Men are, in studies, half as likely to use sun protection as women. Now, why might that be? Well, I think it's sort of our masculine culture. We think our skin is stronger and we don't need to worry about it. Women, on the other hand, many women wear cosmetics, and those cosmetics may have SPF in them, but they're used to putting creams on their skin. Men typically don't. So if people don't tend to put sun protection on, we men are probably worse at it than others. So we need to think really carefully about this. All right, so I haven't said anything yet about your eyes, and eyes are really, really, really important. So UV exposure causes eye damage. They can cause cataracts, which are sort of the cloudiness of the lens, and you might then need to get your lens replaced. Now, UV exposure isn't the only risk factor for getting a cataract, but it is an important one. And the other, probably even more worrisome, is macular degeneration. And that's the most common cause of blindness in people who are 65 and older. Now, genetics play a role, smoking plays a role, but also UV exposure is a risk factor. And again, I'll have show notes that will have a link to something that supports that. So we need to protect our eyes as well. And wearing sunglasses with UV protection is really the way to go. And pretty much anytime I'm outdoors, I'm wearing that. Now, I've spent the last 28 minutes talking about the harms of the sun, but obviously there's some good things about the sun. As we've talked about in our sleep pillar, exposure to sun early in the morning helps our circadian rhythm and may well help your sleep. It also helps to produce vitamin D. And there's some question like whether sunscreens might worsen your body's ability to make vitamin D. The evidence that sunscreens are going to cause you to be deficient in vitamin D is not very convincing. But if you have any concerns about that, you can get your vitamin D tested in your blood. It's not routinely recommended, but if you have a concern, by all means, talk to your doctor. Well, how about annual skin exams, either with your dermatologist or your primary care doctor? Well, the question seems pretty obvious. If skin cancer is bad, then seeing your doctor should be good, so you can catch it early. Well, it's true. The evidence shows that if you undergo screening regularly, you'll find more skin cancers, and including more melanomas. In a large observational study of sort of 600,000 individuals, they showed that if you get screened regularly, you will find more cancers and earlier forms of melanoma. And the likelihood of finding a melanoma will increase almost twice-fold. Well, that seems like a good thing. However, what happens is you may be finding cancers that won't ever cause you harm. In a future episode, we're going to talk about to test or not to test, and we'll explore this issue further. But there aren't any randomized controlled trials on should you get an annual exam. And yes, you may find things, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to change your long-term survival or your long-term well-being. And the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force, which is, advises groups on screening, has found really no conclusive evidence that one should have annual screening. So where do we go from here? As everyone knows, I love N of 1 trials in ourselves to see what works. We take a baseline assessment of an issue like sleep. We try something new, and then we see what happens. Unfortunately, since the risk of skin cancer is a lifetime problem, we can't do an N of 1 study. We can't try something in the sun protection realm for a month and say, okay, now I know what works for me. So even though some of the evidence in the logic chain is cloudier than I prefer, the Dermatology Association recommends sun protection. Skin cancer is common. Protecting against the aging process is desirable for many. Will we, with our sun protection, prevent skin cancer? Again, the data is suggestive, but not as strong as I would like. Well, this is where I net out for whatever it's worth. I am careful. I do wear clothing, and I wear sunglasses with UV protection all the time when I'm outdoors. I do see a dermatologist yearly, and that's definitely going to happen since I had the basal cell carcinoma. So that's where I net out. So you can look at the evidence and you can decide for yourself what you think. Before we close, I want to say that we're going to have a new segment in some of the podcasts on fan mail. Thank you for those who've sent comments and suggestions and topics. Now, the fan mail option within the most podcast apps allows you to send me a note, but I can't respond to you. If you want me to respond, and I'm happy to do so, please try to send me a note through my website or on Instagram, and then I can respond directly to you. And both of those are Dr. Bobby Live Long and Well, and doctor is DR, not the full spelling. But I have received a few, and since there's no way for me to respond directly to you, I want to at least let folks know for some of these that I received your comments. So one person said that I mentioned a table of exercise program, and it wasn't available on my website or the show notes. Well, that's been corrected, so you can go to the show notes episode on exercise, and you can find a handy-dandy summary that might be useful to program your week of activities. Somebody asked, should we change our activities, our training, the sports we do as we age to spare our bones, joints, and ligaments? That's a good question. Somebody asked about additives like calcium that's included in milks and things, and whether that's important. Somebody asked, what type of multivitamin should they take, and what do I take? And what dose or how many per day? Somebody asked about the use of psyllium, which is Metamucil, to lower their cholesterol, their LDL cholesterol. So I'm going to reflect on how best to answer these questions. If you send it to me directly, I can certainly answer directly, and I haven't decided, and I need your input, whether I have special episodes where I just focus on questions or whether I answer one or two at the end of each episode. So I welcome your thoughts about this. Do send me a note. Do send me questions through my website or your podcast app. And I'm particularly interested if you liked having a personal anecdote or a story as a way to lead into the podcast. So until next time, may you live long and well. And I am, as always, honored to be your guide on this journey. Thanks so much for listening to Live Long and Well with Dr. Bobby. If you want to continue this journey or want to receive my newsletter on practical and scientific ways to improve your health and longevity, please visit me at drbobbylivelongandwell.com. That's Dr. Dr. BobbyLiveLongandWell.com.